I don't remember how old I was the first time I heard a door slam like the world was ending. Maybe 7, maybe 8. But I do remember Jax Monroe's howl that night, 3 times. Each one longer, more broken, more human. A dog's eyes don't know how to lie. Damian Cross used to say Jax Monroe was crazy, that a dog trained for war shouldn't live with a child. But I knew he was the only one in that house who saw what no one else wanted to see. Jax Monroe could smell fear before it arrived. He heard my thoughts even when I didn't speak. And when Damian Cross raised his hand, Jax Monroe didn't growl like a dog. He trembled like a friend. I didn't speak. Not because I didn't want to. I didn't speak because I was afraid. Mom told me Damian Cross was our new beginning. That I had to learn to be a good son. Every time he hit me, she'd lock herself in the bathroom and turn on the shower. And me, lying on the floor, I'd listen to the water running. Like water could wash away the sound of fists. Like silence could save us. But Jax Monroe never believed in silence. That night, when Damian Cross lifted me by the neck and threw me against the wall like a trash bag, I didn't scream. I didn't want Mom to cry again, but Jax Monroe didn't wait for orders anymore. He leapt, and that's where it all began. The hospital smelled of bleach, dried blood, and unspoken memories. Room 113, Blacklight Ward. B. The window was cracked open, letting in a sliver of morning light. The white curtains stirred, barely, like they too were breathing. And on the bed, a 10-year-old boy opened his eyes for the first time in 3 days of silence. Ethan Blake didn't cry. He didn't blink. He just stared at the ceiling, as if searching the cracks in the plaster for an explanation, for something his body already knew but his soul refused to accept. By the door, an empty chair. On the floor, a small stain of dried mud. And beyond the glass wall in another room, Jax Monroe, the dog, slept in silence, his body bandaged, his front right leg motionless. But his eyes, those deep amber eyes, stayed awake. "Where's my mom?" Ethan Blake whispered. But his voice didn't reach the nurse walking past in the hallway. No one had answered him for hours. And maybe that hurt more than the bruises hidden under the sheets. Damian Cross was gone. At least, that's what they told him. But words can't erase hands. Or screams. Or the way his mother's eyes dimmed every time the man walked into the room. "Don't provoke him, Ethan Blake. Be a good boy. Don't make him angry." Phrases repeated like empty prayers. In Mexico, his grandmother used to say that silence is a wound too, and when it bleeds, you can't see it. You only feel it. Jax Monroe knew that. From day 1, Ethan Blake remembered the yard of the new house, the sticky afternoon heat, and that big dark dog with a serious stare. A retired K-9 from the Spanish police, trained to detect fear, gunpowder, and lies. "He's a gift for you," Damian Cross had said. "A dog that at least doesn't cry." The word stabbed the boy like a splinter under his fingernail. And Jax Monroe, as if he understood, rested his head on Ethan Blake's lap that very day with a long sigh. From that moment on, they breathed in sync. When Damian Cross raged, Jax Monroe stepped in between. When Ethan Blake curled up under the table, Jax Monroe licked his fingers. And when Lena Hart, his mother, put on her robe to go work the night shift, Jax Monroe stayed with the boy, always awake. In the hospital, the days had no names, only numbers. Only pill schedules. A nurse dropped an envelope by accident. On the tray, Ethan Blake opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper, scribbled in a child's hand. "I'm going to take care of you forever," and a blue ink paw print. He cried in silence. Made no sound. He just pressed the paper to his chest like it was a blanket. "He bit the man," said a deep voice at the door. It was a police officer, not out of instinct, out of choice. The woman beside him, gray-haired, hands wrinkled like dry soil, stared at the boy for a long time. Sierra Knox, the maternal grandmother, just arrived from Sierra Creek 2 days ago. Dogs that bite to protect shouldn't be punished, he said firmly. Where I come from, a dog like that is called an angel on 4 legs. The officer nodded, without emotion, and left. Ethan Blake turned his head toward the window. Jax Monroe was staring back at him. What if he's scared too? The words slipped out in a whisper, like a thought that escaped without permission. Sierra Knox sat down by the bed. Maybe he is Mio. But fear didn't stop him from acting. That's what brave ones do. They tremble on the inside, but stay. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, like the sky was apologizing for taking so long to cry. In the days that followed, more visitors came. A psychologist who spoke as if walking on flower petals. A judge who asked questions without ever raising her voice. And a woman with tired eyes who said she'd once been Damian Cross's girlfriend long ago. Each of them brought a piece of the truth. And with every truth, the weight on Ethan Blake's chest grew lighter. Not everything went back to being okay. But something broke, something in the chain of pain that had gripped their home for so many years. When Jax Monroe was finally allowed into Ethan Blake's room, the boy could already sit up. The dog approached slowly, as if he understood that you have to tread gently through the ruins. Ethan Blake touched Jax Monroe's bandaged ear. You know something, Jax Monroe? I used to think only people could save people. The dog rested his head on the boy's leg. But you showed me that sometimes it takes a heart that doesn't speak to say everything. Out in the hallway, Sierra Knox let a tear fall, then another, not from sadness, but relief. Because in that moment, she knew her daughter, though broken, still had a living son. And that boy, even with fear in his bones, still carried something many adults had lost, the ability to trust. And Jax Monroe, in his sacred silence, had held the key to that door. The first time Damian Cross walked through the door of that white house on the outskirts of Ashburn, it wasn't the thud of his boots that Ethan Blake noticed, but the silence of his mother. Lena Hart stopped singing as she cooked. Her voice, that melody that used to weave together Mexican rancheras and Andalusian coplas, dissolved like sugar in coffee from a clay pot. The walls, once scented with cinnamon and butter, started to smell like cheap cigarettes and worn-out leather. Ethan Blake, this is Damian Cross. He'll be part of our family now. The man didn't say a word. He just extended a large hand, rough like volcanic stone. Ethan Blake didn't take it. From his corner in the living room, Jax Monroe raised his head and gave a low, nearly silent growl, as if his instincts, sharpened by explosions and war zones, already sensed what was coming. Damian Cross smiled, a crooked smile, missing teeth at the corners, joyless. A boy who disobeys his mother doesn't deserve the bread he eats, he said, his voice so dry it cracked the air. Then he poured himself a coffee like he already owned everything. The days after that fell like misaligned bricks, one on top of the other. Damian Cross began to take over the house with his rough presence. Ethan Blake's father's favorite chair. Lena Hart's cherished fork. Ethan Blake's sketchbook thrown in the trash for being useless. Ethan Blake said nothing. He was a child who had learned to read storms before the forecast. His mother's lowered eyes, the way Jax Monroe started sleeping outside his door, and that strange new cold that even the Ashburn sun couldn't chase away. That dog's too. Close to the boy, Damian Cross said one afternoon, seeing Jax Monroe resting his head in Ethan Blake's lap. It's part of his healing, Damian Cross. The vet said. The vet doesn't live here. The mug shattered on the floor. No one breathed. Jax Monroe didn't move. The good memories began to retreat like waves sensing a storm. The last time Mom laughed. The last drawing Ethan Blake stuck to the fridge. The last time Jax Monroe ran free through the fields behind the house. Everything gave way to a new normal. Steps you couldn't predict. orders without reason, punishments dressed in justifications. I hit you because you make me look like a fool in front of your mother. You talk like you're more than a broken kid. You should be grateful I haven't dumped you in an orphanage. Words that fell like nails on rotting wood. And Lena Hart. She only pressed her lips together, lowered her head, and lit another candle for the Virgin of Guadalupe in the kitchen. One March night, Ethan Blake woke up drenched in sweat. Jax Monroe was gone. His heart pounded in his chest like a sacred drum. He went downstairs barefoot, guided by a feeling that smelled like blood. In the yard, Jax Monroe was tied to a post. Damian Cross had a cigarette in his mouth and a belt in his hand. An animal that doesn't respect boundaries ends up just like disobedient children. "Don't hurt him," said Ethan Blake, his voice barely a whisper. Damian Cross turned. His eyes weren't filled with rage. What he had was worse. A cruel calm. "Are you giving me orders, kid?" Ethan Blake didn't answer. He walked slowly to Jax Monroe and knelt down. He stroked the dog's head as if he could soak up the fear. "I'm not afraid of you," Ethan Blake whispered, but his body trembled. Then Damian Cross raised the belt. He didn't hit him. Not this time, but the sound of leather slicing the air stayed with him, etched into his skin like an invisible tattoo. Days later, Ethan Blake found Jax Monroe curled up in his room, licking his wound. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stared, eyes deep like an old well. "I'm sorry," the boy said. "Sorry for being small. For not knowing how to stop him. For not being able to speak louder than he does." The dog rested his snout on the boy's chest. And they stayed like that. Silence against silence. Heartbeat against heartbeat. In April, a letter arrived, the kind that changes something. A distant aunt from Arizona, the only one who still sent letters, had written in shaky ink. "Don't trust men who won't look dogs in the eyes. They won't look at your soul either. Take care of your mother. But don't forget to take care of your voice." Ethan Blake didn't know if that letter was a blessing or a warning, but from that day on, he started writing. Words he couldn't say, drawings he couldn't show. A notebook hidden under his pillow, where Jax Monroe was always the hero, and Damian Cross a monster that melted in the light of truth. One afternoon, while Damian Cross was sleeping, Jax Monroe approached the notebook. Ethan Blake showed him a drawing. Him and his dog, walking through a field of flowers. No adults. Number. Fear. "Do you think we could ever get there?" The dog tilted his head, then licked Ethan Blake's cheek. It wasn't an answer. It was a promise. That was the first time Ethan Blake didn't feel hatred, just a deep sadness. For his mother, for himself, and maybe, though it hurt to admit, for Damian Cross too. Because a man who can't love a child or a dog must have been born without a mother. Weeks passed. Lena Hart started leaving little signs. A soft song while she washed dishes. A quick stroke through Ethan Blake's hair before bed. "Forgive me if I'm not as strong as you deserve," she whispered one night. Ethan Blake didn't respond. But Jax Monroe lifted his head, and this time, his eyes didn't growl. They just watched, as if he knew that sometimes forgiveness begins in silence. The first change was the sugar. "Spoiled kids are addicted to sweets," Damian Cross said, tossing the glass jar into the trash with a sharp crack. Ethan Blake watched the sugar crystals scatter across the floor like salt on an invisible wound. Jax Monroe walked over in silence and licked one grain, slow and deliberate, like he remembered something that would never come back. Next came the music. Too much noise. "Nothing good comes from noise," Damian Cross declared, unplugging. The old record player Ethan Blake and his mom used to share every Sunday afternoon. That day, the house grew bigger, emptier, quieter. The kitchen had a schedule now. So did the bathroom. In this house, there are rules, and rules are not up for discussion. Damian Cross's voice was like a stone round cold with no cracks for air to slip through. Lena Hart smiled less. She started tying her hair back like she did when she worked at the hospital. Ethan Blake watched her walk through the house like she was in an emergency room, where everything could explode at any second, but no one was allowed to notice. Once, Jax Monroe let out a low growl when Damian Cross passed too close to Ethan Blake. The man crouched down slowly and stared him in the eye. "You questioning me too, mutt?" His voice was low, but every syllable cut like glass. Ethan Blake didn't speak. He just sat on the floor next to Jax Monroe and stroked behind his ear where the fur was softest. "Easy," he whispered. Barely audible. "He doesn't know what you are." Damian Cross started checking backpacks, drawings, notebooks. "This is sentimental crap," he said one afternoon, tearing a page in half. A drawing Ethan Blake had made of his mother, like a saint surrounded by marigolds. "You think you're in some Mexican soap opera? There are no miracles here, boy." The page drifted to the floor like a broken promise. Jax Monroe stood up. He didn't bark. He just planted himself between Ethan Blake and Damian Cross. Firm, tense, like he could absorb a blow that hadn't yet come. But that day, there was no blow, just a bitter laugh. "One day you'll understand all of this is for your own good." School wasn't a refuge either. Ethan Blake stopped talking to Cole Bennett. Damian Cross said, "Weak kids cling to each other to spread the crying." Ethan Blake began sitting alone during recess, Jax Monroe waiting for him on the other side of the fence. One Tuesday, it rained. Ethan Blake got soaked walking home because Damian Cross had hidden the umbrella. Rain doesn't kill anyone. Men are made of mud in downpour. That night, Jax Monroe slept curled up against Ethan Blake, his fur damp and warm against the boy's cold skin. Ethan Blake closed his eyes and for the first time wished he wouldn't wake up. One October afternoon, Damian Cross shattered the picture frame, the one with Lena Hart, Ethan Blake, and his biological father. "That photo's an insult." The glass flew. Ethan Blake didn't cry. He just lowered his eyes. Jax Monroe licked his hand hard, and something stirred deep in his chest. Later, in a whisper, he asked Jax Monroe, "Do you miss someone too?" The dog lifted his head and rested his snout on Ethan Blake's knee. "Don't answer," the boy said with a sad smile. "I know you do." Lena Hart started trembling whenever she heard footsteps in the hallway. Ethan Blake noticed one day while she was washing dishes. A spoon clattered to the floor when the garage door opened. "You okay, Mom?" She just nodded, but her hands kept shaking. One night, after Damian Cross had left, Ethan Blake sat next to her and asked, "Did you used to like sad songs too?" Lena Hart looked at him for a long time. Then, without saying a word, she took his hand and pressed it to her chest. "When you were in my belly," she whispered, "I used to sing to the shadows so they wouldn't scare you. But now the shadows weren't scared of anything." And neither was Jax Monroe. He had changed. He used to move with grace. Now he was always on edge. He slept with one eye open. If Damian Cross raised his voice, Jax Monroe would silently move closer like an invisible guardian. Once, Damian Cross slipped in the kitchen and Ethan Blake let out an involuntary laugh. The hand came fast. Ethan Blake hit the floor. Jax Monroe didn't move. He just growled a dry, restrained growl. Damian Cross looked at him. "One more step and you're going back to the pound." Ethan Blake felt something break, not in his body, in his faith. Weeks passed. There were no Day of the Dead decorations that year. The altar he and Mom used to build stayed packed in a box. Damian Cross said, "The dead don't need flowers. The living don't either." But that night, Ethan Blake snuck out. He placed a candle next to the shattered photo of his father, sat in front of it, Jax Monroe by his side, and spoke, "Dad, if you can still hear me, protect her, protect her. I'll be okay. I've got Jacques Monroe. He sees what others refuse to see. And then, for the first time, he cried. Not out of fear, out of love. Jacques Monroe licked his tears. The next day, Damien Cross left for work. Ethan Blake and Lena Hart went out to the yard. Without saying a word, Lena Hart pulled an old radio from the shed. She played an old Mexican song. Your grandma used to sing that in Louisiana, she said, her smile fragile. Ethan Blake stepped closer. Can I dance with you? She nodded. And in that moment, as they slowly turned beneath the autumn sun, Jacques Monroe lay down at their feet, as if he knew that, for just a moment, everything was okay. That was the first moment of peace. And though it didn't last, it stayed etched in the memory of all three, like a wordless prayer, like a promise, that one day the truth would come out and no one would stay silent again. The nurse closed the door softly, as if the noise might break something else inside the boy lying on the stretcher. Ethan Blake didn't look at anyone, only at Jacques Monroe lying on the floor at his feet, head on his paws, eyes burning like a lighthouse in the storm. In the room next door, the inspector spoke in a low voice. He doesn't have any recent visible marks. The medical report doesn't support it. And the bruises from last month? Tessa Quinn asked, clenching her teeth. They said it was a fall in the schoolyard. Confirmed by Sister Grace. And what if he didn't fall? What if he was pushed? No one answered. At St. Augustine Academy, the days repeated like Sunday Mass. Silence in the hallways, heads down. And if a child brought up something uncomfortable, they were told to pray. Ethan Blake had learned to lower his gaze, to let fear seep into his bones like winter through empty courtyards. But Jacques Monroe didn't understand any of that. Jacques Monroe could smell lies. That dog's got shattered nerves, said Father Marcus Hawley one afternoon, after Jacques Monroe growled at Damien Cross picking up Ethan Blake. It's not the dog, Father. It's the man, Tessa Quinn replied, arms crossed. Miss, I say. This with respect. Everyone deserves a second chance. And the children? How many chances do they get before they stop sleeping at night? Sister Grace had worked at the school for 30 years, always with cold hands and a warm rosary. Ethan Blake needs discipline, she would say gently. Ethan Blake needs peace, Lena Hart would answer, but her voice no longer held strength. The nun used to see the bruises, sometimes a loose tooth, a slumped shoulder, but all she ever said was, we'll pray for him. And for his father, too. We all carry our crosses. One afternoon, Ethan Blake wet himself when he saw Damien Cross at the classroom door. Sister Grace took him to the bathroom, cleaned his uniform in silence, and whispered, Don't make your father angry. You're a good boy, but even good boys must obey. Mrs. Lillian Crawford lived next door, upstairs. She claimed she heard everything, said kids these days were too sensitive. That boy cries over anything, so does the dog. They keep each other company, she'd say sarcastically at the market. Haven't you heard the screams? Cole Bennett, the new kid in the building, once asked her. Everyone screams. I screamed too when I was a girl. And here I am. Once, Ethan Blake dropped a box on the stairs, and Damien Cross slapped him hard, without a word. Gloria was on her balcony. She said nothing. The next day, she brought Damien Cross a box of cookies. For the boy, he needs to learn. At the clinic, Dr. Nathaniel Brooks signed the medical report. Minor contusion, no signs of abuse, he said without looking up. Are you sure? Asked Zach Palmer, the vet who'd come with Lena Hart. Completely. I've seen worse. This one's thin, yes, but nothing, Zach Palmer cut in. If it were your child, would you sign that report? Valise shrugged. He's not my child. Avery Stone, Lena Hart's friend, used to visit on Tuesdays. Damien Cross would open the door with a broad smile and a glass of wine in hand. "You're so lucky, Elenita," Avery Stone would say. "You're taken care of." "I'm watched," Lena Hart murmured, barely audible. "Better that than being alone. Don't complain so much. Some don't even have a roof." One night, Lena Hart asked for help. "Avery Stone, if something happens to me, take care of Ethan Blake." Avery Stone said nothing. 3 days later, Damian Cross found out about the conversation. Ethan Blake got his worst beating yet. Avery Stone never came back, and still, there were gestures. Donna Sierra Knox, Lena Hart's grandmother, would send envelopes with drawings of the Virgin and handwritten prayers. To protect him, she'd say over the phone, "Who, Mom? Him or the child? Whoever needs it most. You'll know." One morning, Jax Monroe carried one of those envelopes in his mouth, dragged from beneath Ethan Blake's bed. He dropped it in front of Damian Cross. Inside was a single sentence: "God sees what's done in the shadows." At the hearing, when everything was finally said, when the silenced voices began to crack and break, Sister Grace lowered her eyes. "I thought I was helping." "No, Sister," Tessa Quinn said, without hatred, but without softness. "You just made it last longer." Father Marcus Holly refused to testify. Gloria kept her windows shut for weeks. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks moved to another city. Avery Stone left an anonymous note at the vet clinic. "Forgive me. I failed too." At the hospital, when Jax Monroe was finally allowed to see Ethan Blake again, he made no sound. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He simply walked up, rested his muzzle on the boy's bandaged hand, and closed his eyes. Ethan Blake stroked his head and whispered, "Sometimes only the dogs stay, and sometimes that's enough." In the back of the room, the nurse wiped her eyes discreetly. No one spoke, but for the first time, the silence didn't hurt. No one knew exactly when Jax Monroe stopped being a trained dog and became something else. It wasn't during the missions, in the front line, or when he found the children trapped beneath the rubble of the Dry Creek earthquake. No, it was later. Much later. After he was pulled from service and sent to a quiet village between Ashburn and Cordoba, where the bells ring more often for the dead than the newborn, and the sunflower fields no longer follow the sun, but resignation. That's where Jax Monroe met Ethan Blake. Ethan Blake didn't speak much, but his silence wasn't shyness. It was the kind of silence filled with ancient echoes. "I lived with a mother who smiled with her lips, but never with her eyes, and with a man who smelled like rusted iron and freshly washed lies." Jax Monroe knew from day one. He smelled it at the door, felt it in the hand that petted with fake tenderness. Damian Cross wasn't a father. He was a shadow. Days crawled by, slow as trains that no longer stopped at the town station. Damian Cross grew stricter, colder. He didn't always yell. He didn't have to. A single look was enough. And when he did raise his voice, even the mirrors trembled. One night, Jax Monroe stayed awake at the foot of the bed. Ethan Blake lay curled in a fetal position, arms crossed over his chest like he was bracing for a blow in his sleep. The dog watched, listened. In the kitchen, Damian Cross said to Lena Hart, "That kid's taking everything from you. Even me. He's my son." She whispered, like someone apologizing for existing. "No, he's a burden, an excuse to keep being weak." And then silence. That heavy kind, the kind that settles over everything like ash. One afternoon, Ethan Blake came home from school with a torn shirt and a mark on his cheek. No one asked. No one noticed, except Jax Monroe. He walked over and sniffed the wound. Ethan Blake said nothing, just rested his forehead on the dog's back. And for the first time, he cried, in silence. Jax Monroe didn't move. He just curled around him, like an ancient shield worn, but loyal. The weeks that followed were darker. Damian Cross locked Jax Monroe in the back laundry room. Ethan Blake wasn't allowed near him. That animal's ruining the house, Damian Cross said. I don't want to see that look in his eyes anymore. He judges me. That night, Jax Monroe didn't sleep. He bit wood, scratched dirt, waited. The day everything broke came. Damian Cross had been drinking. Ethan Blake answered back. A barely audible no, but firm. A child's rebellion shaking with fear, but laced with something else, dignity. Damian Cross stood. The glass fell. From the back of the yard, Jax Monroe raised his head. The air shifted. Ethan Blake ran. Damian Cross chased him. Jax Monroe snapped the latch. The crack sounded like thunder. Ethan Blake's head hit the wall. Blood flowed slow like a confession. Damian Cross bent over him, muttered something no one heard. Maybe you brought this on yourself, you little brat. Or maybe nothing at all. Sometimes the silence of the cruel is more horrifying than their words. And then Jax Monroe stepped in. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just walked up to Damian Cross, looked him dead in the eye, bared his teeth like a memory from long ago, and leapt. The scream was short, sharp. Jax Monroe wasn't savage, he was just. He pinned Damian Cross to the ground, one paw pressed to his chest, eyes locked on his soul. He didn't bite more than necessary. He didn't draw more blood than was deserved. Through the pain, Ethan Blake managed to whisper, "Thank you, old friend." The ambulance took 20 minutes. The police 30. But the truth had arrived much earlier in the form of dark fur and honest eyes. Ethan Blake spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Jax Monroe was taken to a temporary shelter while authorities decided if he was dangerous. The doctor who treated Ethan Blake was an older woman with a Mexican accent and a Guadalupe pendant around her neck. "Your dog," she said one night while changing his bandages. "He didn't act like an animal. He acted like a good man." Ethan Blake smiled faintly. "He acted like a grandfather," he whispered, "the kind who tells stories without words." A month later, Lena Hart was cleared of all charges. Damian Cross faced multiple counts. And Jax Monroe, after evaluation, was declared not aggressive but protective. A reporter tried to interview Ethan Blake. The boy refused, but he left a note. "I don't want fame. I just want them to let him stay with me." Jax Monroe never asked me to protect him. He just did it. In this world of empty words, he chose silence that meant something. And that silence saved me. Now, every afternoon, Ethan Blake sits on the porch with Jax Monroe at his feet. Sometimes, they don't speak for hours. They just are. Once, Lena Hart watched them from the window, her hands still trembling. "Do you resent him?" she asked her son. Ethan Blake shook his head. "No, Mom, but I don't stay silent for him anymore." Jax Monroe lifted his head and gently rested it on Ethan Blake's leg. And that was when Lena Hart understood. Forgiveness doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it's enough just to stay, not run, not hit, not scream, just stay. Like that dog who never stopped looking at them with clear eyes. Who, even in the midst of horror, knew there was still something worth saving. A soul, a life, a promise unbroken. Night had fallen like a heavy cloak over the small Andalusian town. The house smelled of old sweat and slaked lime, the kind of scent fear leaves behind when it settles into the walls. Lena Hart, her knuckles red and raw from scrubbing in a futile attempt to silence her thoughts, paused in front of the cracked bathroom mirror. Jax Monroe stood at the doorway, watching her without judgment. Just waiting. Ethan Blake was asleep or pretending to be on a mattress on the floor. The blanket barely covered his thin legs. Jax Monroe patted over, sniffed his forehead tenderly, and lay down beside him like a beaten guardian, but not a defeated one. For weeks, he hadn't eaten whenever Damian Cross was home. Outside, the moon hung round and mute like a cowardly witness. Lena Hart took a deep breath. At the bottom of her purse, Hidden beneath the embroidered handkerchiefs passed down from her mother was an envelope with 3 bus tickets to Devil's Bluff. A friend, Ruthie, had offered shelter in a small fisherman's house. "Just come, don't ask anything," she had said. But leaving meant disappearing. And disappearing meant lying to Ethan Blake one last time. At 2 a.m., with Damian Cross passed out drunk, an empty bottle in his hand and an unlocked pistol on the table, Lena Hart made her choice. She grabbed the backpack, brushed a hand gently through her son's hair. "Ethan Blake, sweetheart. We're leaving," she whispered. He opened his eyes to dark pools full of silent questions. "And Jax Monroe?" he asked, unmoving. "He's coming with us." Ethan Blake sat up, shaking. So did Jax Monroe. But before they could cross the threshold, they heard the sharp click of the living room light switch. "And where the hell do you think you're going?" Damian Cross's voice didn't need to shout to slice through the air. Lena Hart turned slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stepped between him and her son. Jax Monroe growled, low and deep. "This is how you repay me for everything I've done for you, Lena Hart. Running off with that useless brat and the damn mutt. You didn't do anything for us. We only learned how to survive." Damian Cross stepped forward. "So did Jax Monroe. I warned you," he said. "No one leaves my house without my say. This isn't your house. It never was." Then he raised his hand, like so many times before, but this time Lena Hart didn't close her eyes. "Go ahead, hit me. But if you touch me tonight, I swear to God, tomorrow the whole town will know who you really are." Damian Cross hesitated. Jax Monroe growled again, low and deep, like the house itself was breathing with him. At last, Damian Cross dropped his hand. "You'll stay, for now. But don't let this happen again," he said, spitting on the floor as he walked away. Hours later, as the sun barely kissed the rooftops, Lena Hart sat in the courtyard with a cup of cold coffee, her back bent like a broken promise. Jax Monroe laid his head on her knees. He didn't ask for anything. He just looked at her. Ethan Blake came out quietly, the blanket draped over his shoulders. He sat beside her, and for the first time, asked something that wasn't a child's question. "Why couldn't we leave?" Lena Hart swallowed hard, as if every word were a thorn. "Because sometimes, son, there are cages without bars, but the keys are lost. And tonight, we didn't find them. And tomorrow?" She looked at him. Slowly, softly, "Tomorrow, maybe we will." Jax Monroe wagged his tail just a little, a soft thump against the earthen floor. Like he agreed. And in that simple, silent gesture, there was something not quite hope, but close. A seed. A crack in the wall. A beginning. The nurse closed the door with a whisper, barely breaking the silence of the hospital. Outside, the night hung like mourning cloth, and the wind murmured through the dry pines of northern Segovia. Inside room 312, recovery or ruin, Ethan Blake was awake. He wasn't crying, just blinking slowly, as if every time he closed his eyes, something was calling him from within. Jax Monroe wasn't with him. In the corner, a wool blanket lay, folded on an empty chair. The dog's absence had shaped a hollow carved out of the air. Ethan Blake turned his head toward the window. No stars. Sometimes, back in the nights of Montana, when he still lived with his grandmother before his mother left for the Southlands with Damian Cross, she used to say, "When there are no stars, it's because the dogs are guarding them for us." Ethan Blake clenched the sheet in his fingers. There was something broken in his chest, not from the bruises, not from fear, but from the thought that Jax Monroe might be hurting too alone, locked away, with no one who could understand what he had done. Because Jax Monroe had saved a life, his. Down the hall, Cole Bennett stood in front of the soda machine. He wasn't thirsty. He was furious. He'd seen the bruises. He'd heard Damian Cross say that Ethan Blake was weak, a milk baby, a burden. "If you cry, you're not a man," Damian Cross had once told Ethan Blake, not knowing Cole Bennett was behind the wall, listening. Cole Bennett clenched his fists. He was 11, but his eyes already knew what helplessness looked like. He walked to the waiting room, where Ethan Blake's grandmother sat praying, eyes wide open. Sierra Knox had brought a candle of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she lit it whenever she could, even though the hospital forbade it. "Do you think a dog can have a soul?" Cole Bennett asked her without looking. The woman didn't answer right away. She ran her fingers over her rosary, then said, "Some dogs don't just have souls, ... They have memory. And what they remember, they protect with everything they are." In the isolation ward, Jax Monroe lay on the cold floor. He had stopped trembling, hadn't eaten in 2 days. There was dried blood between his paws. The janitor, who passed by every evening, spoke to him in a low voice, like talking to a fallen comrade. "They say you bit a man, but no one says why." Jax Monroe didn't wag his tail. He just kept his eyes open, fixed on a door that never opened. Dr. Nathaniel Brooks reviewed Ethan Blake's medical file without looking up. Bruising on the ribs, older contusions on the back, signs of repeated trauma, he read aloud. Lena Hart, the mother, sat across from him, hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't know," she murmured, but her voice was hollow without weight. Velez looked at her. "You knew. You just didn't want to see it. You didn't want to lose your husband, so you chose to lose your son first." Lena Hart swallowed hard. Her lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. That night, Ethan Blake woke up with a single word in his mouth: "Sorry." He didn't know who he was saying it to. Maybe himself. Maybe Jax Monroe. Maybe his real father, the one who once lifted him onto his shoulders to watch the fireworks on Independence Day in a dusty Arizona town. A young nurse entered the room and turned on the dim corner light. "Can't sleep?" Ethan Blake shook his head. "Want me to call someone?" The boy looked at her, serious. "Can I see my dog?" The nurse hesitated, lowered her voice. "They won't let me, but I can take him something from you. Would that be okay?" Ethan Blake took off the red string bracelet his grandmother had tied around his wrist when they arrived in the Southlands. "Tell him I'm still scared, but I'm awake now." The next morning, when Jax Monroe sniffed the bracelet, he stood up for the first time. He walked in 3 small circles, the way he used to before curling up beside Ethan Blake to sleep. The guard watching him stepped closer. "You miss him, don't you?" Jax Monroe looked up, and for a moment his eyes seemed to speak. In court, when they asked Cole Bennett why he spoke up, he said, "Because Jax Monroe couldn't." Sierra Knox placed an old photo of Ethan Blake on the altar at home. In the picture, the boy smiled beside a watchful-eyed puppy. "Never again," she whispered, lighting a candle. And in doing so, the dark hallway of her memory, filled with shouting men, locked doors, women weeping without a sound, lit up. If only a little. A white-haired woman, sitting in her kitchen, reading the news in the paper, whispered, "Sometimes for the world to listen, a child has to scream with a dog's eyes." And that night, before going to bed, she left the back door ajar, just in case a soul on 4 legs wanted to come in, to heal, or simply to stay. Rain drummed on the roof like a rosary of stones, pounding with the persistence of a broken heart. In the house on Serpent Street, no one slept. Not because they were awake, but because fear doesn't let you close your eyes when it knows something's about to break. Ethan Blake trembled in silence, his back pressed against the wall, staring at the doorframe like he could hold off the inevitable. Jax Monroe, his canine dog, lay by his side, body tense, eyes locked on the dark. His breathing was low, restrained, not from fear, but from loyalty. From the other side, footsteps echoed, heavy, uneven. Damian Cross, You think you can hide from me, you little piece of shit? His voice dragged alcohol and venom behind every word. Ethan Blake clenched his fists. He was 11 years old, but his soul felt ancient. For months now, he'd learned how to breathe without making a sound, to walk without creaking the floorboards, to cry without being noticed. The door burst open. Jax Monroe gave a low growl, but didn't move. He still followed commands. He still believed that even a man like Damian Cross deserved restraint. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Damian Cross roared, and his hand was already swinging down. The blow wasn't heard. It was felt, a silent echo that traveled through Ethan Blake's bones and landed deep in Jax Monroe's chest. Something broke. It wasn't a rib. It was faith. Jax Monroe leapt. There was no bark, no warning. Only the dull thud of a body falling, and the sharp cry of the past caught between the teeth of a dog who had sworn to protect. Damian Cross crashed. Backwards, Jax Monroe clamped onto his arm like an ancient shadow collecting a debt. Blood splattered the carpet. Ethan Blake didn't scream. He didn't cry. He walked to his mother, tied to a chair in the kitchen, her lips split, her eyes like shattered stained glass. "Mom, no more," he whispered, fumbling with the knots. Jax Monroe's not going to wait anymore. Out on the street, a neighbor had heard the chaos. 72-year-old Ms. Martha Keene crossed the road with her wet shawl and dialed the civil guard with a calm only old women understand. "I'm not looking to get involved," she said. "I just know a child screamed like his soul was being torn out," and she hung up. When the police entered the house, Damian Cross was bleeding on the floor, spitting out senseless insults. Jax Monroe sat between Ethan Blake and Lena Hart, his muzzle stained red, but his eyes were still clean. Tessa Quinn, the officer in charge, knelt down in front of the boy. "Who did this?" Ethan Blake didn't answer. He just placed a hand on Jax Monroe's head. He heard what no one wanted to hear. Lena Hart, her voice broken, added, "For years, I thought staying silent kept us safe. But silence only fed the monster." Tessa Quinn lowered her gaze. She remembered her own daughter, dead at 6, at the hands of a man everyone said was good. Meanwhile, Damian Cross screamed from the gurney, "It was my house. That dog's a savage." "That woman provoked me." Tessa Quinn stood. Her voice was a thread of ice. "No, Damian Cross, the beast isn't the one who bites to protect. It's the one who hits to control." At the hospital, Ethan Blake slept with Jax Monroe curled at his feet. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand with a tenderness that hadn't existed since Dad died. "I'm so sorry, baby," Lena Hart whispered. "I spent years waiting for someone to save us. I never thought it would be a dog who had the courage I lost." Ethan Blake opened his eyes without moving. "It wasn't courage, Mom. It was love." He never stopped believing. "We were worth saving." The next day, the headlines read, "Hero Dog Rescues Boy from Domestic Hell." But no photo captured the truth. The truth lived in the way Ethan Blake, still wrapped in bandages, leaned down to hug Jax Monroe. In the way Lena Hart shattered. But Alive gently stroked the dog's head and whispered a prayer in Nahuatl, the one her Mexican grandmother had taught her as a child, Tlatzocamati. "Thank you for not giving up." And in Ms. Martha Keene's eyes, watching from the window, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of cinnamon tea, thinking of her little sister dead at 8, beaten by a father no one dared to confront. This time, she thought, the story changed. And it was all thanks to a dog. At the Dover Falls police station, the air smelled of damp paper and burnt coffee. Tessa Quinn walked down the hallway with steady steps, but her eyes, dark as the cobbled streets of her childhood in Arizona, held more than determination. They held old pain, mingled with restrained fury. On her desk, the Damian Cross Pesquera file lay open like a wound that refused to close. In the corner of one page, A name scrawled in shaky ink, Juliet Arlen. You know what this means, Jax Monroe? Murmured Zach Palmer, the vet, as he stroked the dog's head, its back now bandaged, its eyes sharp as sleepless sentinels. If she speaks... everyone's silence shatters. Jax Monroe didn't respond. He just shifted his body slightly, as if he understood, as if he already knew what was coming. In his eyes there was no fear, only waiting. Lucia lived 3 hours away in a village in Westwood. A small house surrounded by dry flower pots and a shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe, where a faded photo of a girl in a blue dress hung on the wall. When Tessa Quinn arrived, Lucia didn't ask why. She simply poured the coffee and said, "I was 20, and he had the blackest eyes I've ever seen on a man." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Her tears had dried years ago when she ran not just from a relationship, but from herself. She left behind her name, her dignity, her son. He hit me for the first time when I told him I didn't want another baby. Thought I wasn't even good for giving birth. She sighed, then looked at Tessa Quinn with a gaze that carried centuries. I thought leaving would break the curse, but it didn't. Damian Cross stayed and kept hunting for another woman to believe his broken man lies. Back at the station, testimonies began to fall like dominoes. Gloria, the nosy neighbor, admitted she had heard Ethan Blake's screams many times. "But you know how it is," she said with a shrug. "You don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Besides, that kid was always ... weird." Her words left a sticky chill in the air. Jax Monroe growled, low but clear. Ryan Cole, Damian Cross's older cousin, was questioned at 3 a.m. He reeked of stale beer and arrogance. "So what? Now the kid's a saint and my cousin's the devil?" He spat on the floor. Ethan Blake was always a crybaby. His mom, a little ghost of a woman, and the dog, a damn beast, should have been put down. Tessa Quinn didn't answer. She just slowly wrote in her notebook, "Systematic victim rejection, abuse minimization." Then she looked him straight in the eye. "And you? How many times did you see them bleed?" The man didn't reply. He dropped his gaze, and Jax Monroe, standing at the door, didn't stop watching him. Judge Veronica West, a woman of 80, with trembling hands and a voice firm as a church bell, received the reports a week later. She read them in silence. When she reached the testimony of little Cole Bennett, the boy who had seen Ethan Blake's bruises, she paused and said, "The adults stayed silent. But a child and a dog ... spoke, and sometimes that's enough." That afternoon, in the waiting room, Lena Hart held Jax Monroe's leash for the first time since that night. Her wrist was still bandaged, her voice low like someone who's forgotten how to use it. "He saved him. But he saved me too," she whispered. Ethan Blake heard her from the hallway. He didn't say a word. He just walked up slowly and placed his hand on Jax Monroe's warm back. The dog turned his head, looked at him softly, and lowered his tail without losing an ounce of dignity. "Do you think he'll forgive us?" Ethan Blake asked without looking at his mother. "Who?" she asked. "The real dad. The one who died." He paused. "And Jax Monroe too, for not believing him sooner." Lena Hart didn't know what to say, but Jax Monroe, as if he understood, slowly licked Ethan Blake's hand like someone sealing a wound no one else could see. That night, in the journal the psychologist gave him to write his thoughts, Ethan Blake wrote, "Silence is like a net. Sometimes it's soft, sometimes it suffocates you." But Jax Monroe was like a knife that cut through it. He didn't bark for himself. He barked for me. Now I understand. Not all heroes wear capes. Some have scars on their paws. And even though remembering hurts, there's something that hurts more: forgetting that I deserve to be loved. He closed the journal, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't dream of blood. He dreamed of running through open fields, Jax Monroe by his side, the sun warming his back. He dreamed of freedom. He dreamed of being a child again. The courtroom was silent, like a church before the first amen. Tall windows cast a pale light across the faces present. Some looked down at the floor. Others looked at the dog. Jax Monroe lay at the foot of the witness stand, head resting between his paws, unmoving. His gray fur bore scars, but his eyes remained sharp, as if listening to something humans hadn't yet learned to hear. Ethan Blake stepped up to the stand with slow, careful steps. His white shirt had been ironed with care, but the right sleeve barely hid the fading yellow bruises. He was only 10, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had already lived more than one lifetime. The judge, an older woman with the kind of wrinkles only sleepless nights can carve, nodded gently. "Whenever you're ready, son." Ethan Blake took a deep breath. Then he spoke, his voice clear but trembling, like a candle flickering in a sealed room. "I'm not telling this so he gets punished. I'm telling it because I don't want to stay quiet anymore." The room held its breath. Ethan Blake looked down at Jax Monroe. He never asked me to speak. He just stayed. Right there in the doorway every night. When I bled, he licked the wounds. When I cried, he stayed silent. When Damian Cross came into the room, Jax Monroe stood in his way. A tear slid down Ethan Blake's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. One night, Damian Cross threw me against the wall. I thought I was going to die. I didn't scream. Mom was in the bathroom. But Jax Monroe, he screamed for me. The defense attorney stood up. His voice was sharp like a butcher's knife. "And this boy expects us to take the behavior of an animal as evidence." Ethan Blake looked at him, not with anger, with a sadness that hurt even more. "An animal doesn't learn to lie. A man does." Then Damian Cross spoke for the first time since the trial began. "That dog was disturbed. That boy was always weak. They made things up for attention. Lena Hart never knew how to keep order. I was just trying to raise them right." His voice was dry, like scorched wood. "You call raising locking a child in a closet for hours?" The question came from the prosecutor, a gray-haired woman with a Mexican accent. She'd grown up among clay pots and her grandmother's prayers. Now she held photos, medical records, audio recordings. Damian Cross shrugged. "Sometimes punishment is necessary. That's how it was done in my country. No one died." Lena Hart, sitting in the second row, trembled. Her hands searched for something invisible in her lap. Sierra Knox, her mother, held her tight with the kind of strength only women who have buried too many silences can summon. "And is it also custom to hit a woman in front of her child?" the prosecutor asked. Damian Cross said nothing. Then Lucia walked in. She stepped up to the stand with firm steps, wearing a long skirt and a shawl embroidered with Mexican flowers. Her voice was deep, broken, alive. "I was with him before Lena Hart. I left when he broke 2 of my ribs and told me that if I spoke, he'd kill my dog. I didn't believe him. He did." Ethan Blake clutched his chest. Jax Monroe lifted his head. A low whimper, almost human, filled the room. The judge called for silence, but she didn't need to. Everyone already was. Lucia placed a photo on the judge's table. A honey-colored dog, eyes closed, lying at the foot of a makeshift cross. "It took me years to come back, but I'm here for this boy. Because if I had spoken sooner, maybe Ethan Blake wouldn't have those scars." The prosecutor nodded. Then she called the final witness, Cole Bennett, the boy who had seen Ethan Blake's bruises at school. He climbed the stand with a backpack hanging from one shoulder. He was 11 years old. He had traveled from Guadalajara with his mother. "I saw his arm. He told me he fell. But the eyes don't lie. I told my mom. She called the police. And I saw Jax Monroe too. He wouldn't let anyone near him." The room began to breathe differently. Lena Hart asked to speak. She stood up. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it didn't tremble. "I was a coward too. But I wasn't blind. I knew every blow to Ethan Blake was a message meant for me. Damian Cross didn't hate my son. He hated what I used to be before him. She paused, then looked straight at Damian Cross, not with fear anymore, with compassion. But he failed. Because even with his bones broken, Ethan Blake looked at me like I could still save him. Because a dog trained to kill chose to protect. Because even silence, when it lasts too long, becomes a scream. The judge asked everyone to leave while the jury deliberated. 20 minutes later, they returned. This court finds Damian Cross Ortega guilty of aggravated domestic violence, child abuse, attempted murder, and animal cruelty. A sigh swept through the room like a blessing. Ethan Blake stepped down from the stand and hugged Jax Monroe tight, like he wanted to crawl inside his skin. As the judge closed the case, her voice trembled. Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't speaking up, waiting for the right moment to do it, and not letting pain become routine. That night, walking out of the courthouse, Ethan Blake looked up at the sky. The church bells nearby were ringing. In his hand, a letter Lena Hart had written years ago, but never dared to give him. He opened. Inside, in shaky handwriting, it read, "Forgive me for staying silent. Thank you for surviving, your mother." And Jax Monroe beside him looked up as if he could read it too, and maybe he could. The rain fell gently that morning, as if the sky couldn't decide whether to cry or stay quiet. Ethan Blake sat on the porch of their new house, a whitewashed cottage on the outskirts of Ashburn, surrounded by bougainvillea and the smell of fresh bread. Jax Monroe lay next to him, one paw bandaged, his muzzle covered in scars that would never fully heal. He didn't bark. He just breathed deeply, like someone who finally knows he doesn't have to guard every shadow. From the kitchen, Grandma Sierra Knox brewed coffee with cinnamon. The sound of the grinder mixed with birdsong and the distant chatter of an old radio talking about soccer and politics. Sometimes the world kept moving without asking if you were ready to walk again. Ethan Blake gripped the wool blanket covering his legs. The cast was gone, but he still felt the bones snap every time Damian Cross's voice echoed in his memory. "Even the dog doesn't love you," Damian Cross had said one night, throwing the plate to the ground. "You don't even know how to be a son." The echo of that sentence still trembled in Ethan Blake's ribs. But that day, when Jax Monroe woke up and licked his hand, Ethan Blake didn't pull away. He let him. He closed his eyes. He listened. "You knew," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to the dog or to himself. "You knew something was broken, before anyone else did." Grandma Sierra Knox came out with 2 cups. One was for Ethan Blake. She placed the other on the floor, in front of Jax Monroe. "With a splash of milk, just how your grandpa liked it," she said, "though this one looks at it like it's divine punishment." Ethan Blake smiled, just barely. It was the first time in weeks. In the village square, the church bells started to ring. It was Sunday, a day for Mass, a day for public silence and private memories. His grandmother crossed herself and kissed his forehead. "You can stay home today. It's not a sin to stay with the one who saved your life." Ethan Blake nodded. He wasn't going anywhere. That afternoon, Cole Bennett came to visit. He brought a notebook and a green apple. "So you can start writing again," he said, avoiding his eyes. "Sometimes it's easier to tell things to paper than to an adult, or to a judge," Ethan Blake murmured. "Or to a mother who still doesn't know if she can forgive herself," Cole Bennett added. They didn't speak after that. They just sat there, watching Jax Monroe lift his head every time a butterfly passed. Lena Hart arrived in the afternoon. She didn't go in right away. She walked slowly around the garden, letting her fingers brush the walls, as if she needed to ask permission to be a mother again. When she finally crossed the threshold, Jax Monroe let out a low growl, then stepped aside. Ethan Blake looked at her without saying a word. Her hair was shorter, her hands thinner, But her eyes were the same, or maybe not. There was something in them now, not sadness. Worse, memory. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," she said, kneeling in front of her son. "I came to learn how to listen, if you still want to speak to me." Ethan Blake didn't answer right away. He leaned toward Jax Monroe, brushed his ear, then said, "He listened to me every day, even when I didn't speak." "I didn't know how," Lena Hart admitted. "And when I finally did, it was already too late." "Not too late," Ethan Blake said, his voice steady for the first time. "Because you're still here." She cried silently, the way women cry when they've been taught to keep their grief inside. Jax Monroe rested his muzzle on her knee. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acceptance. That night, while the grandmother knitted beneath the lamp, Ethan Blake and Lena Hart sat on the rooftop. They watched the town lights flicker and listened to the distant echo of a mariachi band at a quinceañera down the hill. "Do you think this will ever stop hurting?" Lena Hart asked. Ethan Blake took his time, then said, with a calm too old for a child, "No, but maybe with time, the pain will change. Like when you pull out a thorn, it bleeds at first, but then you can walk again." She took his hand. They didn't speak after that. And so, with the whispering wind, Jax Monroe's slow breathing, and a far-off song about broken hearts and true love, the fragments of that shattered family began, very slowly, to breathe again. As if the soul, at last, had found a place to lie down without fear. Lena Hart sat on the wooden bench in front of her mother's house, in the tiny village of Winter Hollow, where the wind carried the scent of toasted bread and basil. Her hands, thin but tense, rested on the blanket over her knees. Jax Monroe lay at her side, head between his paws, his eyes wide open as if still guarding the night. Ethan Blake played a few yards away with Cole Bennett, throwing an old ball Jax Monroe no longer chased. The boy laughed, but sometimes paused, glancing sideways, like someone still afraid laughter might be a sin. "Do you know why he never barked before that night?" Lena Hart asked, still watching the dog. Her mother, Sierra Knox, was taking clothes off the line. She didn't answer right away. Then she turned, a faint smile on her lips. "Because even dogs wait for someone to free them from silence." Jax Monroe lifted his head as if he understood, and maybe he did. Damian Cross never looked at anyone with arrogance again after that trial. Prison swallowed him without a sound, like mud when you slip in a field. He didn't scream. He just lowered his head when Ethan Blake, tearless, calm in a way that didn't belong to children, spoke in court. "He didn't hit me because I was bad. He hit me because Mom loved me more than him." That sentence split the room in two. Even the judge didn't interrupt. Only Jax Monroe, seated by the bench, wagged his tail just once. That night, there was no applause. Only a deep, heavy stillness, as if everyone remembered something they had tried hard to forget. Now, weeks later, the air was lighter. Ethan Blake slept more easily. Lena Hart cooked with salt again. And Jax Monroe no longer watched the door, he watched the clouds. One afternoon, as the sun slipped through the geraniums on the balcony, Cole Bennett walked up to Jax Monroe, gently stroked his forehead with trembling fingers. "Do you think dogs know when someone's broken inside?" Ethan Blake, lying on the floor nearby, answered without looking up, "No, they don't think it. They feel it, and they stay. Until you hurt yourself, just to check if it still does." Lena Hart walked down the town hall steps with the judge's letter in hand. Jax Monroe had been officially recognized as an emotional support animal. He had the right to stay with Ethan Blake wherever he went. Hospitals, schools, even airplanes, no one could separate them. When she got home, she didn't say a word. She just handed the paper to Ethan Blake. He read it quietly, then turned to Jax Monroe. "You're not a hero anymore. You're family." That night, Ethan Blake fell asleep with one hand resting on his dog's back. He dreamed they were walking through an open field, no walls, no yelling, no clocks. Jax Monroe didn't bark. He just walked beside him. And for the first time, Ethan Blake wasn't afraid of falling behind. The next morning, Lena Hart made coffee for her mother. As she poured, Sierra Knox touched her arm. Sometimes I wonder if we, the women of our generation, were raised to forgive too much. Lena Hart set the cup down. She didn't answer right away. She watched Jax Monroe drinking water and Ethan Blake picking wildflowers with Cole Bennett. Maybe, but now we know that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. It means looking pain in the eye and not letting it shut our hearts. Sierra Knox nodded, her eyes misty. Then she laughed softly, like someone letting go of a knot in her chest. Funny, isn't it? It took a dog to teach us that. In the town square, they hung a photo of Jax Monroe beside a plaque that read, "He didn't make noise, he just protected." And that changed everything. The older women from the neighborhood left flowers at the base of the photo. Some cried. Others whispered prayers. One of them, her white hair pinned in a perfect bun, knelt down and said almost in a whisper to the image, "I wish someone had believed me when I said it hurt." That night, as the moon rose over the old rooftops, and the air smelled of lavender and wood smoke, Jax Monroe lay down beside Ethan Blake's bed again. Not out of duty, not to stand guard, but out of love. Because he knew, as only those who've seen fear written on a child's skin truly know, that to protect doesn't mean to bite the monster. It means to stay, to wait, to never leave, even when the danger is gone. And when Ethan Blake, half asleep, whispered, "Thanks for not leaving me alone," Jax Monroe didn't answer. He just breathed deep and stayed. Like a heart that doesn't beat for itself, but for someone else. In a forgotten corner of Andalusia, where houses smell like old wood and orange trees bloom as if unaware of human sorrow, a quiet story unfolded between a broken boy and a dog who had already seen too much war. Ethan Blake was 10, and he carried more silence than words. He lived in the long shadows left by a man who turned love into a threat. His mother, Lena Hart, smiled with a sadness that fooled everyone but herself. And Jax Monroe, a German shepherd, with ash-colored eyes, watched them both with the calm of someone who has waited too long for an order that never came. Pain has a name, and sometimes it even has a voice. Ethan Blake whispered one night, lips cracked, eyes distant. "Damien." Cross, the stepfather, didn't yell. He hit with sharp words and punishing silences. A spoiled kid needs a firm hand. And you, Lena Hart, need to learn how to choose better. His voice dry as the fields after harvest settled over them like dust. But Jax Monroe's eyes didn't forget. Not the enemies. Not the fear. And when Ethan Blake's body hit the wall, the dog leapt. Not like a beast, not like a hero, but like someone who, at last, stopped obeying the world and obeyed his heart. The trial was long. The town's whispers were crueler than the truth. But in the end, the truth came out. Not in shouts, but in a whisper, a child's recording, a broken woman's testimony, and the howl of a dog who could no longer stay silent. Today, Ethan Blake lives with his grandmother Sierra Knox in a little house where the bread smells like anise and the windows are always open. Jax Monroe sleeps at his feet, maybe dreaming of meadows instead of trenches. "A dog doesn't heal the past," says the grandmother, her hands slow as she strokes his back, "but he can take care of the future." And so, in a world where justice often arrives too late, this story reminds us of something the older women of Mexico and the Southlands have always known, that silence is no virtue when it hides injustice. That truth, even when it hurts, always finds a way to break through like bougainvillea in the crack of a wall. And that sometimes the most faithful soul doesn't speak with words, but in the way it stays when everyone else walks away. Sometimes the world breaks without making a sound, like the moment a child stops calling out "Mom" with joy, or when a woman who once wove dreams with threads of moonlight learns to hide her bruises with powder and smiles. Ethan Blake was 10 years old when he stopped speaking. If I tell the truth, he thought, Mom will shatter. But Jacques Monroe, a dog with more scars than healthy legs, didn't need words. He lay in front of the door every night, as if he could hold back the monster. And when he couldn't anymore, he jumped. He jumped for Ethan Blake, for all the times no one else did. Dogs don't have a voice, Grandma, the boy said later. So God gave them courage, she replied, to speak with their bodies. She knew it well. She had loved a man who only knew how to yell. She had believed in the promise of an altar until it turned into a cage. And still, she forgave, not for him, for herself. Because resentment is a dark room where the dead speak. Too loud. Some say animals don't understand the human soul. But Jacques Monroe knew when a lie dressed up as a father. He knew the silence of a brave woman sounds like a thunderstorm held back. And he knew without anyone telling him the exact moment to bite down on injustice. To you, woman with steady hands and wise eyes, who has cried on the inside to hold others up on the outside. Have you ever dreamed of a friend like that? Someone unafraid to walk through fire, just to pull you out alive? This story doesn't ask for heroes or perfect punishments. It just wants to sit beside you with a cup of coffee and the scent of cinnamon and whisper something simple. You're not alone. The truth takes its time, but it comes. And sometimes it comes in the form of a dog who doesn't know how to lie.